They say every girl dreams of being a princess. I didn't. I was born one. And from the moment I understood my full name, Thalira Voss, daughter of a centuries-old European dynasty steeped in tradition and international alliances, I also understood that my life wasn't mine. There was no room for wants, mistakes, or human slip-ups. Every gesture was monitored, studied, critiqued, every word measured. Smile elegantly, walk lightly, speak only what's necessary. I was molded like porcelain, beautiful, admired, and utterly untouchable. I grew up between gilded walls that hid a coldness no one saw. My appointments, my dresses, my diplomatic dinners, all meticulously choreographed. I was a portrait, a symbol, a duty, and for a long time, I believed that was enough. But even the prettiest frames can't stop the picture inside from starting to crack. I first heard the sound of those cracks at 22, shortly after my engagement was announced, to the world's press. A calculated marriage, perfectly suitable and completely hollow. He was kind, polished, strategic, a prince, on paper, flawless. But between us, there was no warmth, just formalities, obligations, and the coldest of curtains, duty. And there, amid the celebration, the white flowers and the camera flashes, something in me screamed, not audibly. It was a desperate silence no one noticed, but I heard it. From that day, everything changed. Not outwardly. Outwardly, I kept smiling, signing, performing. But inside, I began to disobey, to daydream, to crave something I couldn't name. I didn't want to escape. I just wanted to breathe. And then, like someone thrown against their own fate, he appeared, not in a grand ballroom, not at a state meeting, but opening the door of the car that would take me to yet another formal event. Julian, the new driver. He didn't look at me like others did. He didn't lower his eyes. He didn't force pleasantries. He just watched me with a calm that disarmed. Me. And I, used to forced bows and smiles for convenience, felt a strange unease. He saw me. Not the princess, not the future wife of a prince. Me. And for some reason, I didn't yet understand that day. It left me silent for hours after, because I knew, without knowing how or why, that his gaze had opened a door inside me, and if I wasn't careful, I'd end up walking through it. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I kept up with my commitments, spoke with ministers, smiled for cameras, watched rehearsals for my own future like someone watching a play they didn't write, and worse, didn't believe in. But Julian was still there, always punctual, always discreet, always with that comfortable silence that offered space, not weight. I started noticing details. The way he adjusted the rearview mirror unhurriedly, how his hands gripped the wheel with strength and grace, how he avoided looking at me, but heard everything. And that's what undid me. He listened. When I let slip a sharp comment, a veiled critique, a sigh escaping between one ceremony and the next, he didn't respond with flattery. He responded with presence, sometimes with a question, sometimes a half smile, sometimes silence, and all of it said more than the polished words of the men around me. I remember the first time I laughed for real in his presence. It was something silly, a remark he made about the photographers shoving each other for a shot of my engagement ring. He said, without looking at me, that it seemed the world wanted to put me in a cathedral's stained glass before knowing if I liked open windows. I laughed, and in that laugh, something locked inside me for years broke free. That day, I realized how empty I was inside, and how that emptiness had been polished, dressed, perfumed, applauded. Julian didn't give me answers. He just showed me, with his simple, steady, honest existence, that I could be more than what I'd been taught, to represent. Over time, I started looking forward to the drives, not the engagements, but the journey to them. It was in the car, in that brief space where the world stayed outside the tinted windows, that I could breathe. We spoke little, but every word carried weight, intention, truth. Julian never crossed the line. But somehow he never retreated either. And that invisible line between us, what couldn't be said but was felt, was what drew me most. Because in a world where everything was exaggerated, protocoled, and artificial, he was the only thing real, and I was tired of living in the fake. The first time I touched him was without thinking. A sudden break, an instinct, my hand on his arm, just a reflex. But even after the car steadied, my hand lingered a second longer. He didn't react. He just looked at me. No shock, no hesitation, just that same gaze I already knew, the one that said, "I see you." And that's when I understood. I'd already walked through the door. There was no going back. After that afternoon, our silences took on a new texture. They weren't just pauses between words anymore. They were spaces charged with tension, presence, something about to happen. And still, neither of us crossed the Z line. Julian remained the same discreet, controlled, almost unreadable man. But there was something new in his eyes. A question, an invitation, or maybe the same fear growing in me. Because I knew, with the clarity of a soul stirring, that we were dangerously close to a point of no return. At a gala one night, where my presence was required as a symbol of alliance between two noble families, I dressed as protocol demanded. White silk, heirloom earrings, plastered smile. Julian waited at the side entrance as always. But that night when he saw me, he looked away for a moment. And that's when I realized he was fighting too. Not for me, but against himself. And for the first time, I felt alive and cruel at once. Because this love, this feeling growing between us like something inevitable, came with a price, and that price was too high to ignore. During the party, my mind was elsewhere. I smiled, greeted, danced, but all of me was tethered to that silent moment outside. Julian waited in the car, as always. And when I finally returned, I sat in the back seat with my heart at war. The silence between us lasted a few minutes, long, cutting. Then he spoke, without looking at me, his voice steady, but his breathing uneven. "You don't belong to this place." Those words, said so simply, were the final key. I knew he wasn't just talking about the party, nor just the nobility. He meant the destiny laid out for me, the gilded world where I was meant to exist without ever living. And he was right. I didn't belong to it, but I still didn't know how to escape. That night, in my room with its closed windows, I cried for the first time over something that wasn't pain or sadness. It was deeper. It was grief for the version of me I knew was dying, the obedient princess, the molded woman, the display piece. And as tears fell soundlessly, I knew, not as a wish, but a certainty, that I couldn't keep living this way. And Julian was more than a man. He was the mirror of my freedom. The next morning, something in me was different, not visibly, not in a way anyone around could pinpoint, but I felt it. It was as if the shell had started to give way inside, as if my skin, still bound to the roles I'd always played, knew it couldn't pretend much longer. I didn't wake with a plan, but I woke without fear. And that absence, in a life built on restraint and caution, was more dangerous than any scandal. I was ushered to formal breakfast as usual, sat with poise, answered about the day's scheduled commitments, smiled where expected. But my mind no longer obeyed. It wandered. It was out there, with a freedom that wasn't yet mine, but that I craved with a hunger no protocol could contain. That afternoon, I asked to go alone to an exhibition. It wasn't a lie. The exhibition existed. The lie was the reason. I didn't want to see paintings. I wanted to see him, Julian. When I got in the car and saw him there, hands steady on the wheel, eyes forward as always, I realized how just being near him made me breathe differently. The drive was long, and the silence between us held more words than any conversation I'd had with the diplomats around me. At one point, without thinking, I asked if he'd ever loved someone he couldn't have. He took a long time to answer. Too long. And when he did, it was a yes that sounded more like a confession than a reply. After that, nothing more was said. But nothing more needed to be. I started making excuses, meetings that didn't exist, delayed commitments, facade institutional visits, all to be in the car, all to be with him. Julian kept resisting. Never crossed boundaries, never looked too long, never let his body draw closer than necessary. But there was something in the small gestures. The way he held the door, how he stopped the car in absolute silence, how he never interrupted when I spoke of my doubts, that told me he felt the same. And maybe it was that restraint, that pained respect, that made it all so true. Little by little, my life split in two. The princess and Thalira. The woman the world saw, and the woman I was when I took off the invisible crown. With Julian, I could exist without being read as a symbol. I could speak without weighing every sentence. I could feel anger, doubt, longing. I could even be silent, and he'd still hear me. It was in that contrast I realized. I wasn't just falling for him. I was falling for the woman I became beside him, and then came the official invitation. The ceremony would be moved up, my engagement formalized. The palace needed good news. Alliances needed strengthening. My father called me privately, said the future of our family was at stake, that I was the bridge between old and new, that the choice he'd made for me was the best. I listened as I always had. But for the first time, as he spoke, my mind was elsewhere. It was in the car, on the wheel, in Julian's steady, silent hands. And that's when I understood. Either I'd live as they expected, or I'd live as I truly was. There was no rupture, no scandal, no grand gesture. The truth is, the end of obedience happens like a thread fraying slowly, until one day it snaps. And when it does, there's no sound, just freedom. That week, I kept smiling for photographers, attending official duties, wearing the silhouette of perfection so many idealized. But inside, something had already broken. I didn't belong to that frame anymore. I was the woman who looked at her own reflection and said silently, "You won't live whole if you keep trying to fit." I stopped being afraid, not of what others would say, but of what would happen to me if I gave up on myself. That was the turning point, realizing the worst prison is the one you accept for the sake of approval. And I'd spent too long being what they expected. Too long, I realized, is also a form of violence. Julian was reassigned. I heard it from a staff member almost casually. Team change, security restructuring. I understood. It was a clear message. They knew. Not enough to accuse, but enough to threaten. I tried to keep my composure, to act like it didn't hurt. But it did. It hurt like they'd ripped away not just the man, but the only part of my life that still belonged to me. That night I walked barefoot on the balcony, hidden from everything and everyone, my heart raw. I didn't cry, I trembled. Because the love we'd built, even without touches, without kisses, had taken root deep inside me. And now, he was gone. And I was, once again, the perfect woman everyone applauded. but no one saw. It took me 2 days to act, 2 days of diplomatic, smiles and gala dresses wrapping around me like everything was fine. 2 days of rehearsing speeches, escapes, excuses, until I realized I didn't need to justify anything. I didn't owe anyone but the woman I saw in the mirror. I found Julian at a modest inn outside the city. He was standing when he saw me, body rigid, breath held, as if expecting me to say goodbye. But I said nothing. I just walked to him and hugged him. For the first time. Long, silent, desperately calm. And when he finally whispered that this could destroy us, I answered with what courage I had left. Not living this would destroy me more. That night, without a map, without a plan, without certainty, we decided to run. Not as blind rebellion, but as the only path to truth. I left everything behind. The titles, the speeches, the wedding dress, my place in a story I never wrote. I left with my heart racing and my hands steady, because deep down, I knew this wasn't an escape. It was a rescue of myself. And with Julian beside me, on that dark road where the future had no name, I knew. Love may not be safe, but freedom is the only way to exist whole. The first night away was strangely quiet. No alarms sounded, no one chased us, no helicopters hunted us from the sky, like in movies that romanticize real escapes. The truth is, the world doesn't collapse right away when you break from it. It just starts to forget you. And what I feared most happened with unsettling speed. No one came after me. The princess had vanished, and the silence around it was louder than any scandal. Julian drove for hours without asking if I wanted to turn back. He knew. The decision had been made long before we left the city. It had been growing in me for ages, ripening like fruit hidden in a field of ice. And now, for the first time, there was light, and there was hunger. He looked at me like he couldn't believe I'd really come. And I looked at him like I knew, with every cell in my body, that coming was the only way to stay alive. We lived the first days like two fugitives without a guidebook. We didn't know what came next. We had little money, no certainty, a small room borrowed from a friend of his, and the constant sound of our hearts trying to grasp what we'd done. And still, through all the hardship, there wasn't a single moment I wished to go back. There was fear, of course, discomfort, a world of unknowns. But there was also something I'd never been allowed to feel within the walls of perfection. Peace. Our love, now free, didn't become easy. It became true. We shared everything: bread, doubts, uneasy silences. Julian, with all his strength, had insecurities too. He asked if I'd ever regret it, if the world, calling me a traitor, would steal the pride of my choice. And I answered, with the only truth I knew, I was a princess. But you were the first man to treat me as a woman. The press found us, of course. Photos circulated. Headlines screamed, scandal, royal shame, missing princess. But none of them knew the real story. I didn't run for passion. I ran for dignity. I ran because if I waited for the world to let me be free, I'd die before I lived. Family reached out. Officially. Coldly. A short letter. An attempt to preserve appearances. The marriage cancelled as mutually agreed. No direct mention of me. No word from my mother. My father remained utterly silent. The only one to break through was a former palace employee who sent an anonymous message, simple and powerful. For the first time, I see you alive in your eyes. Don't stop. And I didn't. Julian and I found modest jobs. We started a new life with what was left of us, and with everything finally beginning to grow. He was everything I'd never been allowed to want. And I was, at last, everything I'd never been allowed to be. The months that followed were the hardest and the realest of my life. Each dawn felt like learning to exist from scratch. I discovered that freedom hurts. Yes, because it demands choice. And choosing, every day, who you want to be is infinitely harder than just obeying. But I also discovered there's a strength born when you no longer need approval to keep breathing. I had no more privileges, no jewels, no gilded invitations, with my name in bold. I had calloused hands, grocery lines, overdue bills, and a whole soul, for the first time. Julian and I faced the realities that come when love is no longer forbidden, but every day. We had fights, frustrations, long silences. It wasn't the secret romance between a princess and her driver anymore. It was the life of two real people trying to hold on with dignity and affection. And even when he doubted himself, and me, I loved him. Not like in fairy tales, but with feet on the ground. Because my love for him was never an escape. It was a root, and roots, even through storms, endure. Over time, people started to forget. The papers stopped mentioning us. The royal family moved on with other faces, other headlines, and I, once a display, became a shadow. But I'd never felt so clear. I started writing chronicles, letters, short pieces about freedom, love, and choices. I was published anonymously, then under my own name. And when that happened, something shifted, not outside, but within. I realized that even without a crown, without applause, without the weight of blue blood, I still had a voice. And it didn't need to be loud. It just needed to be mine. Julian opened a small garage. I, a writing studio. We rented a house with a modest garden. We planted trees, cooked together, created our own rituals from morning coffee to kisses before bed. And every day was a choice. He could leave, so could I. But we stayed, and that was the most beautiful part. Years later, I received a letter, handwritten, from my mother. Short, hesitant, but true. It said she missed me, that she saw me in my writing, that even if she didn't understand everything, there was pride. I cried for hours, not because it hurt, but because that, from her, was the closest to an I love you my story ever imagined. Today, when people ask if I regret it, I smile. Because the answer lies in how I wake up every day, without a script, without mandatory makeup, without fear. The world called me foolish, rebellious, ungrateful, but I prefer another name. Survivor of a fate written by others, of a life that wasn't mine, of a prison with gilded walls, and beside Julian, who never promised me thrones, but always offered me ground. I built a kingdom where love isn't a secret, it's a choice. They say I ran away, that I abandoned the destiny millions would dream of. Maybe they're right. I did run, but not from the title, the responsibility, or the country. I ran from a version of myself that only knew how to live for others. I ran from the gaze that told me what to be. I ran from perfection. And in doing so, I found something far more valuable than a crown. I found my voice. Today, I'm not a princess. I have no palaces or servants. But I have a love that doesn't hide, a home that doesn't cage me, and a soul that no longer needs permission to be whole. Julian and I aren't a fairy tale. We're truth. We're imperfect, but free. And that, to me, is royalty enough.